Hey everyone, and welcome back to Build UX. In this episode, we're going to tackle the complex CSS grid layout for our article section and hopefully finish out the styles for this project. Before we dive into the CSS grid layout for the article, let's fix a quick linting error that was caught after the last episode. So this media query here for the main should say media. Instead, we had a typo there. Let's give that a save. Everything should be fixed up at this breakpoint now. And next, let's turn our attention to the desktop layout for the article section. And in order to help us out as a visual aid, let's turn on our grid layer and our spacing overlay to kind of dissect the layout that we're going for. Let me zoom in here so we can inspect this further. And I'm going to hide the toolbars so that way we can take a look at this design in more detail. So in planning out this layout, we see that there is a fair bit of complexity in terms of the spacing rules of the different elements inside of the article. But I promise as we get into the CSS grid code, everything will start coming together, especially using named grid template areas, and make this way more achievable than it might initially look. So to help us out with this, I think we're going to focus on this largest breakpoint with the full layout that we see here. And then we'll reduce the viewport to kind of go in between what we currently have with this kind of tablet size breakpoint, as well as the mobile layout that we've already finished. We'll want to kind of span the difference between these and see at what point we can bring in this full layout and see if there's any need for intermediary solutions between those breakpoints. To get started with this, let's find our article selector in our CSS. It's right here. Now previously, we went up to a max width of 1199 to add this margin bottom for when the article and aside section stack. Let's take a look using our inspector tools at our preview here, just to kind of see what breakpoints we already have in place. So I'm going to open responsive design mode and let's drag this out to evaluate what's going on. So if you recall, I believe it's at the 1200 breakpoint that we bring in the aside with our related articles and the section selector. So this might actually be a little bit cramped for this full CSS grid layout that we see for this desktop breakpoint design. But as a start, we'll just add a media query at a min width of 1200. And we'll want to target our article selector. And within this, we can kind of plan for anything above this breakpoint, but we might have to adjust this specific media query as we evaluate the different viewport sizes. So at a min width of 1200, let's explain our ideal layout for the full desktop view. Now here in my preview, this actually isn't wide enough. So to help us out, we have a full screen preview of the UI, and this will evaluate what it looks like all the way up to 1920 pixels wide. Back in our code, let's use our design as a reference as we start drafting out this CSS grid layout. So the first thing we want is to declare that this is display grid. Next up, let's focus on the grid template columns of this layout. So in terms of our columns, this is a pretty decent representation of how each individual content area should function inside of the layout. But what we have to think about is providing this layout all at once for all of the child elements from this parent article class. So it's a little bit tricky to visualize here, but let's just walk through it and see if we can figure this out. So the first thing I'm noticing is kind of the narrowest width that we have set is the 512 pixel width for the nutrition information that we can see down here in the article footer. So this will function as our first column. Then we're basically going to have as much space as we can to the right of that until we hit this gutter of 128 pixels. And then finally we have a column that's sized at 160 pixels for this article image. All right, so back in our CSS, we have our grid template columns. So as I mentioned, we have 51.2 rems for the width of the nutrition info section down here. After that, we basically just want a column that will take up as much space as possible. So let's set that to be 1 fractional unit. Next up, we have our 128 pixel gutter that we see between the article content and this article image on the right. So this will be our space oct. We'll take care of that column sizing. And then finally, we have the article image itself. We know that has a width of 16 rems. So that takes care of our columns. Next up, let's focus on getting our rows established at this breakpoint. So the rows, if we kind of parse the design that we see here on our right, we want the headline to take up whatever space it needs based on its own height. So we'll just set that to be an auto row in terms of its sizing. Next up, we know we have this space quad as a gutter between the headline and the article content. So space quad. Following that, we have part of the article content that's just going to be based on whatever height it needs to take up. There's a bit of a vertical overlap between the article image and the bottom of the article content. So at first, we're just going to have an auto row. And then what we need to do here is we see that we have a 128 pixel gutter between the content and this article footer section, but we have to account for the remaining height of this article image. So the article image is 160 pixels tall. We're going to subtract out 128 pixels from that, and that would leave us conveniently with 32 pixels, which is actually our space double. And so this basically accounts for the amount of overlap we want between the article content and this first supporting image. Next up, it's nice and easy because we know we have space oct as our gutter between the content and the footer. And then that footer section, which wraps the nutrition information, the share section, and the second image, we basically just want to be an auto row as well. So this actually describes the overall behavior of the CSS grid, but we need some way to assign these various elements to their specific grid area. And while you can do this by going into, let's say, the article headline and telling it that it should go from the first column to the second to last column and so forth with rows, it's a lot easier visually to kind of picture and predict what's going on, and also to handle assigning sections of the article to their respective grid areas by using grid template areas. So these are named layout areas within our CSS grid. And what's great about this is we can use that ASCII-like syntax that we used for some of our other sections in the design that'll really pay off in dividends for this really complex layout. So for our first row, let's just describe what we want the behavior to be. We have 4 columns. We want the headline to span 3 of those columns, and then we just have an empty space at the end. Next up, we basically just have this space quad row that just functions as a gutter. So we know we want all 4 of those columns to be empty. In the next row, we're going to have 2 of the columns occupied by our article content. So we'll place content into the first 2 columns and then have the remaining 2 empty. Next up, we have this interesting overlap where the content spans the first 2 columns. We have an empty gutter and then the first image. So let's say content in the first 2, that gutter, and then let's just call this first image for that rightmost column. Next up, we have a row that has a gutter across 3 of the columns, and then the first image finishes out. And now we get to our last automatically sized row. Let's call this first 51.2 rem section the supporting section, which represents the nutrition info and share content. Next to that, we'll have a second image, and we'll be able to pin that to the right in this second column that we've created. And the remaining 2 columns are unoccupied. So if we give this a save, everything's going to be pretty broken if we look at our preview here. So you can see that because nothing is assigned to a specific grid area, CSS Grid is basically just going to fit things wherever it can. And we may actually have to adjust some of the HTML structure so that way each content area within our article has a dedicated HTML element that we can assign to a specific grid area. So to help explain that further, I think the first hurdle that we want to overcome is getting all of our content wrapped in a div for this subheading as well as these paragraphs, so we can actually assign that to a specific part of the layout. So in our HTML here, let's try to find our article headline here. Now below the headline, we have our H2 subheading, as well as these 3 paragraphs for the article content. So we want to wrap this in a class called article content. Open that up, move these HTML elements inside. It's looking good. Now I know in a previous episode, we introduced this article images wrapper to assist with the CSS grid layout we used on mobile breakpoints and some of the smaller mobile to tablet sizes. But looking at what we'll need to achieve with this CSS grid, we need each image to be assignable to its own CSS grid area. So we might actually want to remove this wrapping div. So that way each of these images are a direct descendant of the article element. And then after we tackle this desktop layout, what we'll do is we'll go back through all of the smaller breakpoints and adjust things accordingly. We might actually be able to use this parent CSS grid layout coming from article to actually handle the layout for all sizes, and that should simplify our implementation a little bit further. So let's give this a save. In our app.css, it's time to actually assign these elements to their respective grid areas. So we have article heading directly below here. Let's say that the grid area for this is going to be headline. Next up, let's target that newly created class for article content and get that assigned to a grid area as well. So we'll say grid area is going to be content. Next up, we need to go down to our article images. So if we scroll down a fair bit, now anything using the article images selector will no longer be needed. So we might use this as a reference for the smaller viewports, but for now I'm going to comment this out. So just hitting Control or Command and the / will comment it out in VS Code. Next up, we have article image. Let's find our first image. And for now, let's assume we want it always to be assigned to the same grid area. So let's back this up a bit and say that grid area is going to be first image and move this main block above the media query. And I might want to space these out for now. Let's do a similar thing for the second image. So we'll copy this down and replace first with second. The last thing we need to do is make sure there is a way to target this nutrition information as well as the article share section. So this is actually another case where we want to introduce a wrapping div. Let's say this is the article supporting section. That'll wrap both of these elements. Let's grab both these section tags, move them up, make sure our indentation is looking good, get rid of any unnecessary spacing, give that a save, and above nutrition info, let's add a selector for that. So the article supporting, its grid area in this case is going to be supporting. Okay, now if we give this a save, let's see if we have everything assigned properly. Hey, so it's looking pretty good. It looks like we have quite a bit of spacing between the headline and our article content. You can see we actually have a really similar layout to our design target, so we might just need to investigate what's going on here. So it looks like our article heading has a specific margin bottom on it. We'll need to set that to be 0. Any margins that we see introduced on specific elements within this layout will no longer be needed because instead we're having actual rows or columns handle the gutters between elements. So back in our code, let's find the article heading here. So we have a margin top of 0. We actually don't want any margin bottom either. And I see that at this lower breakpoint, we set a different margin bottom. But I think what we're going to do, because the CSS grid layout is working so well at the desktop, is actually have it handle the spacing and layout of elements at all breakpoints. So I think we're actually going to undo this media query here. So if we remove that, check out our preview once more. It looks like with that large line height, we have a fair bit of extra spacing, but in terms of the actual prescribed layout, things are looking correct. And if we click on our article element and inspect it using DevTools, let's turn on the overlay grid. So you can display the area names to get a good idea of how this layout works. So we see our headline spanning 3 columns as needed. The content takes up as much space as it needs. It looks like it doesn't need that much vertical height, but at smaller breakpoints where some of this text might wrap, it might actually overlap vertically with the first image. The nutrition information is looking good. Looks like we have some extra margin here. And then we actually need to position the second image to align to the end of its column. Okay, so let's get the second image positioned and then focus on removing this extra margin. So let's find our second image. The grid area is second image. And then we'll want to align self. Actually, in this case, it will be justify self, I believe, to the end. Give that a save. That's looking correct in terms of its position within the column. Next up, let's investigate the margin inside of our supporting section. Find the article share. Looks like we have some extra gap here at the bottom. Let's see if we can figure that out. So it looks like there is no margin being set. CSS Grid seems to be providing extra vertical height as needed. Let's evaluate things at different breakpoints and see if this is specific to this desktop size and see what we can do from there. Checking out our article content, see if there's any other margins we need to clear. It looks like we probably want to get rid of the margin bottom on the last paragraph inside of the article content. So let's find the article body in our CSS here. Looks like we reset margin top to be 0 and also set the color. We set the margin bottom at this max width breakpoint to be space default. And then we actually don't have anything going on for desktop. So it looks like this is a browser default. We'll want the same spacing at all breakpoints. We'll get rid of that. But one thing we'll want to do is make sure this only gets applied to elements that are not the last of type inside of that content area. And then for the final article body element, so we use the last of type selector on this directly. We want the margin bottom to be 0. Give that a save. Okay, investigating our preview here, we can see that we have no margin. CSS Grid is going to determine the height of this row as needed, but at least we won't have any margins contributing to that unnecessarily. So one thing I'm noticing at this desktop breakpoint is we have no margin below our main section to ensure that the main layout never hits the bottom edge of the viewport. So let's find our main element and take a look at our media queries here. So at a max width of 1199 pixels, we're going to have this space double come into play. I think what we want to do is take a look at our design here. It seems like we want the space quad to come into play when we increase the left and right padding in our main layout. So if we evaluate when that occurs, let's take a look at our smaller preview here. At this point, I think we have the left and right padding introduced. I believe that happens at the 1024 breakpoint, it looks like. Let me just double check this real quick. Yep, so I think at this point, if we scroll all the way to the bottom of our design, we have our main. Right now it has the margin of space double at the bottom, but I think we want to increase that to space quad. So this would actually be at a max width of 1024 pixels. Let's duplicate this media query. Update it to be a min width of 1025. Margin bottom will increase to be space quad. Then a save. So now once we exceed 1024, we should see that there's plenty of bottom spacing to match our desktop designs here. Now the next thing we want to evaluate is with this large layout, we want to evaluate at what point there's not enough room for these images to appear with this asymmetric layout and see if we instead need them to go back to their position underneath the article content to be side by side, and then also fix up our mobile layout where we have the images overlapping each other slightly. So just to illustrate that point further, we want to get back to this mobile layout that we originally established, but we removed the article images wrapper, so we'll need the parent article layout to handle that now. And then we want at a near breakpoint beneath this desktop layout for these images to go to their side-to-side appearance, so that way there's enough room for everything to fit. So looking at this 1920 layout, let's see if we can evaluate with responsive design mode at what point there's really not enough room for this to work well anymore. So things are looking good around the mid 1800s here. It looks like right around this point, I think it's 1704, we start impeding on the layout of this aside with these related article cards. And you'll see that there's not enough room in this second image column based on the gutters that we need, as well as this fixed dimension for the nutrition info and first image column. So it looks like 1704 is that breakpoint at which we want to bring these images side by side. So that means we'll have to go back to our article class. We scroll down here. And we'll want to adjust our breakpoint. So at a min width of 1200. That was our first guess. We actually are going to have to bump this all the way up to 1704. Display grid is actually something we're going to use at all breakpoints now. So if you recall in an earlier episode where we initially handled the responsive design of these images, at 475, we had them side by side, and anything below that is where they had that interesting overlap. So I think for our lower media queries, we want to target the in-between sizes. We'll have a min width of 476 pixels, and we'll go up to, hopefully, this max width of 1703. With our article class, we're going to have similar setup, so we can actually copy these grid properties over and adjust things as needed. So what's going to change at this point is basically based on the article images layout. So let's reference what we did here. We had 2 grid template columns at 16 rems each with a gutter of space default between them. Now, because we have other elements that are going to need to span this grid gap, we'll actually want to make that a column explicitly. So let's go back up here, and with our grid template columns, we have 16 rems will be the first image. We have that space default gutter, another 16 rems for the second article image. And then we basically just want to take up as much space as possible below that. Now our rows might get a little bit simplified here because we no longer have this interesting overlap between the article content and the first image. So let's evaluate that. We still have an auto row for our headline. Space quad will be between the headline and the content. We'll have another auto row for the content, which looks good there. I think we'll want space default instead of double to be the gap between the article content and the images. Next up, we actually have the size of the images, and let's instead do space default between the images and the supporting section. Next up, let's think how our grid template areas are going to be modified. I think we want the headline to span full width. The same will be true of our content. This gutter row still won't have anything in it. Next up, it looks like we have another row for that space default, which isn't going to have any content inside of it. Now the following row is actually where our images will live. So we'll have first image, we'll have that space default gap, then our second image, and then nothing in that right 1FR column. Lastly, let's have our supporting section span across all 4 columns. Okay, let's give this a save and see if everything works as we'd expect. So taking a look at our larger preview, let's go below this 1704 breakpoint and evaluate how things worked out. Okay, so we're getting pretty close here. The article headline is taking up a fair bit of space, but is going full width. Same with our content. Our images are looking good. It looks like we are missing a gap between our images and the supporting section. So let's evaluate that real quick. So we need another, since we added one more row, we need another empty row defined here in our grid template areas. That's looking better in terms of spacing all across the board. And I think that actually handles this breakpoint. Let's evaluate it as far down as we can. One thing I'm noticing is this headline looks a little bit large at this breakpoint still. You can see it's kind of wrapping a little too much. We might want to evaluate that typography spec. Things are looking good, at which point it goes to full width. Things are still working well here. Hopefully all the way down, if we can get lucky, down to that 475. Let's see if that'll work. I think we're good to go with that. So now all we need to do is address the layout below 475, because as you can see, it's broken here. And that'll finish out the CSS grid work for the article. Okay, so let's get this media query moved down real quick, just to keep things organized. Get our indentation fixed. And we'll want one last media query for our article section. This will be at a max width of 475. Open that up. Again, we can copy most of these properties over. We'll have to adjust them. And as we did before, let's reference what we did with the article images. Let's see if we can remove these upper breakpoints as needed. Let's get rid of this code comment just temporarily. We can cut this out, clean things up there. Scroll back up to our article. Let's paste this in for reference. We can keep that commented out. All right, so at the smallest breakpoint, we had this interesting calculation in the column sizing of our layout to account for the image overlap at this mobile breakpoint. So this may get a little bit tricky, but basically we want to incorporate these calculations into both the columns and rows while still considering the remaining elements of the article. So for columns, we basically want all of these calculations. And at the end, I think we just want a 1FR column in case there's any extra space up to that 475 breakpoint. Now rows is going to be a little bit trickier here. So let's just take a look at what we have so far. We have auto. If we inspect this design, we're going to have space double instead of space quad after that. We'll have another auto column for the article content. It looks like space default will follow that, which is looking good here. Next up, we're going to have this interesting overlapping layout for the rows that account for all of the article images. So we'll copy this, replace the 16 rems with that. We'll want the space default following that section, and then an auto-sized row to account for the supporting content. Okay, grid template areas. Headline spans all 4. Content spans all 4 columns. The image rows might be a little bit interesting here. So we want the first image to occupy the first 2 columns, and then leave the latter 2 unoccupied. Next up, we want first column empty, and then second image to occupy the second and third columns. This auto column at the end there will just be empty still. And then we do have another row that accounts for the necessary layout of our second image. My first inclination is actually to leave this empty and have the height of the second image automatically be handled by CSS Grid. So let's just give this a save and see if it'll serve our needs. We can actually get rid of this article images selector entirely now. All right, so now we can look at our smaller preview here. Things are looking a little bit broken. Let's evaluate what's going on. So let's give this a refresh just to double check. It looks like this second image isn't getting assigned as needed. So to help us out with this, let's turn on the article layout. It looks like it's supposed to be assigned here, but maybe it doesn't have enough space available. So let's try putting it explicitly in that remaining row that we didn't declare. Give that a save. And one thing I just remembered is we actually have CSS on those images for these smaller breakpoints. So we're actually going to want to clear out all of these properties. I'll still want the z-index of 1. Let's make sure there's no other unneeded code here. Give that a save. Okay, that actually fixed it up nicely. Okay, so let's take off our overlay grid just so we can evaluate this without any distraction. That's looking correct. Let's increase this viewport size. Make sure it works all the way up to that 475, at which point the images go side by side. Next up, let's just check out our breakpoints in general here. So things are still looking good. We can actually use our full screen preview here. Let's turn off the overlay grid. Things are looking pretty good. The size of these cards for the related articles looks a little bit large here. What we might want to do is evaluate at which point we want to bring those in. I think this typography is still pretty massive for this particular headline at this breakpoint, but I think 1400 is probably where we want this to be introduced. So we may have to adjust a number of media queries. As you'll recall in previous episodes, we said that those were kind of our initial guess. Now's the time that we have all of the surrounding context established to really get those tuned up. So let's first evaluate our main section, which is handling the arrangement of the sidebar and the article. And it looks like we picked 1200 to be that breakpoint at which this gets introduced. So at this breakpoint, we want to bump this up to be 1400. And you'll notice that the padding on the left and right is actually handled by CSS Grid from this size onward. So we want to make sure that the previous breakpoint that handles padding also gets updated to 1399. Let's give that a save. Next up, let's keep checking on our other breakpoints in here. So this margin bottom at 1199, we'll want to evaluate that as well. Let's take a look at our larger preview here and see what's going on with the layout of these elements. Looks like there's quite a bit of spacing here. I think that's just because of our preview height. So if we take that off, things are looking good. Let's reduce the width of this down. See how we feel. Looks like we need to adjust the spacing between our article and aside at this breakpoint, and also the arrangement of the section number and related articles. So let's just go back through and make sure everything gets accounted for. So the first thing we mentioned was the margin bottom between the aside and the article. We'll want to bump this up to be 1703. So that way there's spacing between them until that 1704 breakpoint at which this takes over. And actually, my mistake, this would be at that 1399 breakpoint until they stop stacking. Next up, let's scroll all the way down to our side. You can see here we have the 1199 breakpoint. That'll become 1399 on each of these. This will become 1400. Keep checking things for that responsive layout further down, updating accordingly. The reason why we're not doing a global find and replace is because we want to be sure that we're only updating what we're intending to update here. Okay, I think that takes care of those. Let's evaluate with our full screen preview once more. So everything looks good at desktop size. Around 1700, we should see the article images collapse. Spacing is still looking good. We'll want to address the headline sizing before we finish up here. Okay, now we collapse down around that 1400 breakpoint. The vertical spacing between article and the arrangement of our side looks good. Keep going further. We reduce the padding on the left and right. And this last breakpoint, we get this unique image layout. Okay, so I think we just want to adjust the type spec, at which point it needs to get a little bit smaller, and that'll finish out the styling of our project. So let's find T display. Now we had a max width of 1399. I think we'll want to bump this up to that 1703 and make sure it only becomes its largest size at 1704. Give that a save. Let's evaluate things one last time to make sure that we like that decision. Okay, so now there's much more breathing room in the design. At all breakpoints, things are looking really good. And if we compare it one final time to our target design, let's make this full screen as well. And turn off our grid and spacing layers just to clean things up. You can see that overall, we have everything styled up as needed across all breakpoints, and that should take care of the CSS for this whole project. In the next episode, we're going to review our code, see if there's any final updates or tweaks or improvements to make, and then we'll do some final testing, make sure our app is accessible and holds up to a couple standards that we're going to check for. And then that should wrap it up for the Nutrition UI series. So thanks again for watching. Be sure to check out the next episode. We're going to polish everything up and get these things finalized.